Welcome to the PharmaPodcast, conversations with industry experts and business leaders about important and current topics in pharma, biotech, and medtech. I'm your host, Sam Tarantino. This is Season 5 of the PharmaPodcast, and on this episode of the PharmaPodcast, we will discuss Florida and its plans to import drugs from Canada. Florida is making headlines for its bold move to import prescription drugs from Canada, a strategy aimed at reducing healthcare costs in that state. This shift could potentially transform the landscape of pharmaceutical importation in the U.S. and set a precedent for other states. To help us better understand this complex and fascinating topic, I'm thrilled to have DANI Peters with us. DANI is president of Magnet Strategy Group and president at the Alliance for Safe Online Pharmacy Canada. DANI is an expert in healthcare policy and has been closely following the developments in drug importation policy. Welcome to the PharmaPodcast, DANI.
Thank you very much, Sam, for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you. So tell us about the Alliance for Safe Online Pharmacy Canada and its mandate.
Yeah, so the Alliance for Safe Online Pharmacies Canada is a project of ASOP Global, as we call it ASOP. And ASOP is a global nonprofit organization committed to keeping the public safe from illegal online sellers of pharmaceuticals. Here in Canada, we've been established over the last 5 years, and we represent all members of the established pharmaceutical supply chain. And our commitment is about keeping Canadians safe from these illegal online sellers, and also to protect the integrity of Canada's legitimate pharmaceutical supply chain. And so we're very proud to represent the interests of Canada to the public as well as to the government.
So with respect to this new program, tell us, can you provide an overview of the US FDA's stance on importing drugs from Canada?
Yeah, so in order to understand the US FDA stance, we have to go back in time a little bit to 2019, when at the time then President Trump had introduced a program to allow for importation from Canada. And that really translated into what's called the FDA final rule. And that rule established what's called the Section 804 importation program that allowed for US states to apply to become legitimate importers under this program. And so President Trump introduced the program. It actually even was initiated by Florida expressing interest in importing medicines from Canada. But then we also have seen with the Biden administration had continued this support for this program. President Biden had introduced an executive order to allow for importation from Canada and essentially affirming the support for this program. And so the FDA's stance comes from this, and that we've seen that now this is then translated into now what the discussion today is the FDA accepting Florida's application to import medicines from Canada.
And how has the U.S. policy on drug importation evolved over the years?
Yeah. So this, we have to go back in time even further. So we have to look back into the early 2000s, and we kind of joke around, we're sort of going back in time, and it's almost like playing itself. But in the early 2000s, it was very popular, this idea about importing medicines from Canada, and internet pharmacies were sort of all the rage at the time. And we have to then look at the Medicare Modernization Act of 2003 that provided the Department of Health and Human Services with the authority to permit importation of prescription drugs from Canada if the HHS secretary certifies to Congress that they pose no additional risk to public health and safety. And so this happened at the time. We actually have seen still that there are internet pharmacies that exist, and that Americans do order from them. This is part of what ASOP Canada, what we talk about, is that some of these sites maybe pretend to be Canadian, or they're not, or they might be legitimate brick and mortar in Canada, but their online activities are facilitating the sale of non-Health Canada approved medications, might be approved in other jurisdictions. So that issue still persists. But no HHS secretary, even when the Medicare Modernization Act had been introduced and this provision included, no HHS secretary was willing to actually go further and create and implement a program. But this importation program is really based on that provision of this 2003 Act. So that's where it goes back. Now there are questions about, this is a key part in terms of implementation of this program, is as a Health and Human Services Secretary being able to guarantee health and safety. And so this goes into then, and we can kind of go into it, is the implementation of this program and how that can be assured, and how that also translates into the costs of the program and the cost of the medication, and whether or not that can be assured as well.
All right, let's focus our attention now on the recent developments in Florida. What are the recent changes in Florida regarding the importation of Canadian drugs?
So if we go back, also in terms of Florida's role in this. So as I mentioned, even before President Trump has introduced what led to the final rule from the FDA, Florida had announced its intention to import medicines from Canada. And so once the final rule had been issued, Florida did follow up and submit their application to the FDA, which was part of this Section 804 importation program. There was a back and forth with the FDA. The FDA was asking questions. This had ultimately led to the state of Florida suing the FDA for the delay in deciding on its application. But what happened was that Florida, the FDA had to decide on Florida's application by the end of 2003, and then we had this decision that came up in early January 2004 that basically accepted Florida's application. And so that's sort of the period that Florida had gone through. And I can go into further steps that Florida took in order to qualify under the program, but that was sort of what led Florida to this point.
So let's explore the motivation behind the changes. What factors do you think prompted Florida to allow the importation of drugs from Canada?
Yeah, so what really prompted Florida was looking at drug prices. So we know that drug prices is an issue that gets a lot of attention in the United States, and there's demand for leaders in government to find solutions to address the price of medications. I'm assuming in Florida also there is a population, elderly population, seniors population, that where the prices of medications is a significant issue, and so there's a need for leaders to take action. And what we have found is that this issue is very popular. So it might be difficult to explain the nuances of drug pricing and the various different policy responses, but importing medicines from Canada is just very popular. And so a lot of people ask me, why are we talking about this? Why are we working on this? And sometimes when I say, when you understand it within the lens of being popular and there are high political incentives to show leadership, then things make more sense, because there are much better ways through policy to address that have been discussed in the U.S. and to maybe address this issue than importation, which might not yield the benefits that the population there is expecting.
I always wonder, why not just pass a law that says drugs sold to public institutions in the state must not exceed the Canadian price? I wonder, is that not an easier path forward? But I guess you're right. It's not a popular thing to say.
Yeah. It's just easier just to say, let's get drugs from Canada. And people really, it's something that people, if you're on, you're in public and you're looking to have a line that's going to resonate with people, it tends to work. And so we've seen this now play out where it's not just Florida, but a number of other U.S. states have introduced their own programs or legislation to import medicines because it's popular.
Yeah, hold that thought. We're going to get to that in a bit later. Okay. So I guess it's populist. I guess. Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Okay. Let's go. Okay. So let's look at the FDA's approval process then. Walk us through the process? How does the FDA evaluate and approve Canadian drugs for importation?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, in order to qualify under this program, a U.S. state has to serve as the sponsor of the program. So they have to serve as a sponsor, and then they can have a co-sponsor, which might be a pharmacist or a wholesaler or even another state. And so they have to then together submit this to the FDA, and it has to be on a per drug basis. So as we've seen with Florida's applications to the FDA, they've actually listed the specific drugs that they want to be part of this program, and the list has shifted over time, but we have the latest list, and it might be updated, but they have to submit on a per drug basis, and the approval is based on that. Another key part of the approval is who the foreign seller is in Canada, and so Florida did submit with a foreign seller. The foreign seller has to be a drug establishment license wholesaler under Health Canada. They have to be distributing Health Canada approved medications, and then they have to work with an importer, which is on the U.S. side. The other piece is that they have to assure that there is going to be testing that's happening in the United States for safety or for quality, and also there has to be relabeling that happens in the United States. So it has to be relabeled with the FDA label once it crosses into the U.S.
Okay, so what about safety and quality? What measures are in place to ensure the safety and the quality of imported drugs? Now, you and I know the Canadian drugs are equal to the American drugs. They're as safe and as of high quality, but there are concerns. Products are being handled by different distributors at different facilities. So walk us through that process. What measures are in place?
Yeah, so we looked at the letter, the acceptance letter that the FDA had sent to Florida in early January, and they kind of wanted to remind of the obligations. So the manufacturer or the importer has to conduct testing of the eligible prescription drugs for authenticity, degradation, and to ensure that the eligible prescription drugs are in compliance with established specifications and standards. So we know from Florida that there are labs that are set up and designated to participate in this program, and that the tests are supposed to be provided to the state of Florida, and they are in turn providing the results to the FDA. So that is something that's been established under the program, and that sort of the importer, the state, the sponsor is responsible for overseeing this process.
Okay, do you think this scheme will have any impact on drug prices, both in the U.S. and Canada? And how will this importation impact drug prices in both Canada and the U.S.?
So we look at on the U.S. side, and this is where we continually raise questions about, is this program going to deliver the savings that are expected? If you take into account the testing that is required, and all just the additional logistics that are required, and then just the fact that Canada, in terms of our pricing, this is sort of the education that I know our counterparts in the United States do with officials in the United States, is to explain drug pricing in Canada. These prices are negotiated for within Canada. There's no guarantee that those negotiated prices are going to apply to the United States. And then there are actually probably costs in Canada of the parties here to comply with the U.S. program, and so we think that there is a flaw in when there is an analysis of this program and the cost savings, not taking in all those factors into account. In terms of Canada and pricing, I don't know if I could speak to the pricing piece, but I think that our primary concern is really about supply in Canada. And what we focus on is the fact that Canada is a tenth the size of the U.S. population. The supply that we get in Canada is what we get, and manufacturers are likely monitoring the medications that are supplied to Canada and what might be making its way to the United States. And I say back to the early 2000s again. There was a significant concern at that time about the impact on supply in Canada and measures, preventive measures taken to protect the supply that actually exacerbating shortages in Canada. And so we know that in Canada we deal with drug shortage challenges. We don't need any more shocks to the system, and this certainly might create those shocks by creating that concern that supply that is available here might be making its way to the United States through this program.
Are there any legal or regulatory hurdles still facing this initiative?
So I think the one thing I want to say, and I do want to applaud Health Canada for the steps that Health Canada has taken in response to the FDA final rule to prevent bulk exportation to the United States. And so Health Canada had put in an interim order and then followed up with regulations to look at the FDA final rule and to look at Canada's drug shortage challenges and ensure there was greater accountability on the side of drug establishment license wholesalers or drug establishment license holders if there are supplies that are medications, Canadian medications for Canadian population making the way to the United States, that information is to be reported to Health Canada. And so we have, and our colleagues in the United States have made the public aware, politicians or officials aware of that Canada has taken these measures, and Canada has said publicly that they're willing to take greater measures if needed to protect the supply. And so we're very encouraged to see Health Canada and also the minister speaking up to that. But now that the FDA has put out more detail in their acceptance letter to Florida, we believe that there are some additional gaps that Health Canada might need to address to ensure that we are not further exacerbating drug shortages through this program. And they could put measures in place to match the requirements that the FDA has put to Florida, basically to match that and ensure that there's greater transparency on the potential outflow of Canadian medications to the U.S.
So do you think that this could result in restrictions for the DEL holders and potentially requiring a license to export?
In terms of, I don't think it would result in restrictions, but it might be more transparency regarding activities. And certainly we're concerned about adding an additional burden, an administrative burden to DL holders in Canada that are supporting a population outside of Canada, especially if it's Canadian medications. We're very proud of our industry here in Canada that legitimately exports medications to the United States for Americans, right? There is an export market. So this is separate from that. This is really about, this is a program and adding a burden to our Canadian, members of our pharmaceutical supply chain, adding a burden to them to supply a market outside of Canada that are medications intended for Canadians. So we have a significant concern about that.
All right. Are there other states in the U.S. considering similar measures?
Yes. So Colorado submitted an application to the FDA that was actually denied, and that was denied about in December timeframe. And Colorado has since indicated their interest in resubmitting their application to the FDA. And other U.S. states have also submitted or have passed legislation to import medicines from Canada. We have Texas as well, and then even over the last couple weeks. Virginia and West Virginia have introduced legislation to allow for importation from Canada. The legislation is not required, but it just speaks to, again, the political incentives to do it. Again, it's popular, so if you introduce legislation, you can kind of demonstrate to your population you're taking steps to import medicines from Canada. But we can expect that now we have this precedent that other U.S. states are going to follow Florida and submit, model their applications after Florida to submit to the FDA.
All Right. Well, let's explore public opinion. You and me as consumers, how has the public reacted to the idea of importing drugs from Canada? Let's just say both Canadian public and the U.S. public. What are your thoughts?
So I think that sometimes we judge based on media interest. There was, media interest in this issue in Canada a few times when this has kind of popped up in the news, and Canadians are already concerned about drug shortages, and so would presumably be concerned about this additional channel to send our medications to the United States when we ourselves are dealing with shortages. So there is the public, and there also are health practitioners that are part of the public as well that are dealing with drug shortages day in, day out, and again do not need another challenge to exacerbate that shortage. And so we're hearing concerns when we talk to stakeholders in terms of the frontline health professionals and patient organizations, the concerns that they have regarding this risk to our drug supply. At the same time, we want to assure those members that Health Canada has taken measures to protect our supply and is willing to take more. And so, what we wouldn't want is even just by virtue of the mention of this and the news to create panic. And so we want to make sure that to know that there are those measures that are in place and a willingness to do more. But there is a concern. This is different from, of course, on the U.S. side. When we talk about the public, as I mentioned, this is a proposal that's very popular. But frontline health professionals in the United States are concerned about this as well. So the American Pharmacists Association and there's been actually a letter from I think over 60 pharmacy-related organizations that have submitted a public letter expressing concern about FDA's approval of this plan for reasons related to supply chain security and safety. Again, we know our medications are safe, but this ability of just different parties that are entering into the system now and wanting to assure that there is that level of supply chain security related to that. So again, there's a variety of opinions, but we think in Canada it's because of the concern about shortages that the support is going to be pretty low.
What do health policy experts say about this development? You mentioned the Pharmacists Association, but health experts.
Yeah, so health experts also, groups like the Pew Charitable Trust that have in the United States have looked at issues related to supply chain security that have expressed concern about that. There's been a lot of work in the United States to create what's called track and trace legislation. So that assures that basically everything from the manufacturer to the end that this can be traced down. And a lot of work has been done, investment to make that possible. And so the concern is that now we're allowing for this this other program that might undermine the investment that's taken place in this track and trace program, and so we see health, and then just health policy experts expressing concern based on those grounds. There are those that we explain that are really concerned about the extent of drug access in the United States. And so there are groups that express support for importation, maybe among a variety of other measures. But we do spend time trying to educate those groups to explain that this is not going to generate probably the savings that they're expecting based on all these other factors I mentioned in terms of the testing and the fact that the prices have been negotiated in Canada won't necessarily apply to the United States. So encouraging to look elsewhere to address this policy challenge.
Future outlook. What can we expect in the future regarding the U.S.-Canada drug importation policies?
Yeah, so when we looked at also Florida's letter to, FDA's letter to Florida had made a request for, there's basically additional back and forth that's going to happen between the FDA and Florida. So things like labels and also about the final drug list. So I think there's additional back and forth that's going to happen. The other factor is there is the U.S. presidential election coming up. So again, I do say it is a political issue. It is something that, again, both President Trump has supported and President Biden. And so it is something that can come up on the campaign trail. Also, Governor DeSantis is someone who is running for president. So I just mention it because it is something, because it's politically popular and supported, that would continue to come up. And then also we can see other U.S. states are going to submit their own applications or pass legislation to allow for importation from Canada. So that's what we can expect in the United States side, is just continued drumbeat of attention and preparation, either to participate in this program. On the Canadian side, we have to see what happens. As I said, Health Canada has these regulations in place. I think there might be some exploration of additional items that Health Canada could put forward to address some gaps in response to what the FDA has sent to Florida. So I think that's something to look out for as well.
Any advice for Canadian consumers? Should Canadian patients be worried?
I would say that Canadian patients for now should know that Health Canada is looking has put in measures and is looking at additional measures. So I would say that if you are a Canadian patient and you're concerned, I think writing your local member of parliament, sharing your concern is something that can be quite helpful, just to encourage continued attention on this topic. But to know that for now, this program is still months away from implementation in Florida. So we can use this period now to just encourage our leaders to address some of those gaps with the current approach. Again, it's very good what we have, but just additional gaps while we wait for Florida and the FDA to work together to implement the program.
All right, let's explore a little further the potential for expansion. We discussed the possibility that this policy will expand to include other states. Could it potentially be expanded to other countries?
It has been brought up by particularly Senator Bernie Sanders, who is actually the chairman of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee in the U.S. Senate that has oversight over the FDA. And the idea of going beyond Canada and expanding this program to the UK or the EU in addition has been raised before. And so it seems to be that importing medicines from Canada is particularly popular, like scores well on polling. It's because Canada is looked at as friendly country, neighbor to the north, back and forth. But so it remains to be seen about whether or not that would poll positively. But I know that ASOP Global does some polling, and people in the United States just they want to have another access point for medications, and so we could probably assume that it would be popular. To import medicines from the EU, maybe not as much, I don't know, but there is that potential out there. So if, for example, Health Canada does, the Canadian government, take additional measures to to prevent the bulk exportation, and basically the U.S. says, Canada is not really a place for us to work with. We don't really have a willing partner here. There might increase the incentive to look to other countries. And again, this concept has been raised initially by Senator Sanders, so it could be something that that the administration and another administration looks to.
Any closing thoughts? What are the key takeaways for our listeners about this topic?
So I would say that on the importation file, things have certainly ramped up with the FDA's approval of Florida's application. We can expect a continued attention to this issue in the United States in the months ahead. Health Canada has taken measures to prevent the bulk exportation, but additional measures are likely required now in response to the FDA's acceptance of Florida's application. And so members of Canada's established pharmaceutical supply chain should continue to remain engaged, focused on what measures Health Canada is taking, and continue to work with us in the sector to encourage that to happen.
And how can our audience get in touch with you?
So we are at the Alliance for Safe Online Pharmacies. You can look us up. It's www.buysaferx/pharmacy. And you can locate us there, and I'm happy to meet with anybody who's interested in speaking about these issues further.
DANI, thank you for joining us on the PharmaPodcast. Contact details for Dani will be made available on our website at the pharmapodcast.com. Thank you for listening. The Pharma Podcast is available to listen to for free on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcasts, and on our website at thepharmapodcast.com. You can also find us on YouTube. Please subscribe and follow me on LinkedIn to stay up to date on future podcasts.